So there's a lot about tariffs in the news, obviously, and there's one sort of glaring point about tariffs or about our international financial sort of system that hasn't been pointed out in any news article, so I figured I would point it out here. It also, in case you want to ever do research in finance, this will bring up a really important point on financial research. So this actually goes back to my dissertation. In my dissertation, I had a component of it that was on insider trading. And what I was looking at is leakage prior to mergers and acquisitions, and looking at how information leaked around the world in all these different countries. And when you do this research, your first thing you think about is saying, okay, well, let's look at countries that have insider trading laws versus countries that don't have insider trading laws, right? And see if information leakage is greater, let's say, where they don't have insider trading laws. The first place you get tripped up with this, though, is that many countries have insider trading laws, but they don't enforce them, right? So if a country has an insider trading law but doesn't enforce it, well, then really it should be in the group of doesn't have insider trading laws, right? But the idea, so the first thing I kind of learned in that dissertation there when it comes to financial rules is to look at what the laws are, but then look at the level to which they're enforced, right? And that matters. So with that in mind, let's look at the idea of what's going on with tariffs. Now, what we have in a lot of these trade agreements, right, is they say, okay, we're going to trade, but there's restrictions on the parties. So the idea is, going back to the 80s and so forth, when we started these trade deals, a lot of people were against them. They said, oh, well, you're going to move this manufacturing offshore to get around environmental regulations and to get around workplace safety regulations and so forth. And so what we did is in those regulations said, okay, well, if you're going to manufacture overseas, you have to abide by certain guidelines in terms of workplace safety and environmental regulations. And if you didn't abide by these, right, then we would be able to take action, and one of those actions would be tariffs, right? It's not like an automatic, but the idea is, when we see you're not abiding by the trade agreement, then we'll take corrective action, which can ultimately lead to tariffs. So in these trade agreements, one big thing that was written in was currency manipulation. So the idea is if you manipulate your currency, and the U.S. Treasury labels you as a currency manipulator, then that would kick off some enforcement, right? Again, it doesn't automatically say, okay, then, if we label you a currency manipulator, then 30% tariffs. But what it means is, we're going to start a conversation, and then which if you don't fix your currency manipulation, tariffs is one of the things that we can use to correct the problem, right? So the idea is, our trade agreements say you can't be a currency manipulator. Now let's look at kind of why countries manipulate their currency. So if you remember the balance of payments, right? The idea here is we buy a lot from abroad, so foreigners have to invest in the United States. So we buy a computer, send that $1,000 abroad. The foreigners have to take that $1,000 and invest it in the United States. It has to be investment in the United States because they need to create the demand for dollars to offset our supply of dollars when we are buying those goods. Now, here's the thing. I've just said that foreigners buy U.S. assets because we buy foreign goods. But it's perfectly equivalent to say, well, we buy foreign goods because foreigners want to buy our assets, meaning one doesn't cause the other, they're jointly determined, right? So to give you an evidence of this, a while ago, Bernanke, when he was Fed chair, was testifying before Congress, and people asked Bernanke, senators, how do we reduce our trade deficit with China? And Bernanke said, well, have the Chinese develop better financial markets in China, which is an absolutely correct answer, and a correct answer, I'm not saying the, but what he's saying is solve the financial account problem, and that'll solve the current account problem, meaning if the Chinese invest more in their home country, that means they'll create less demand for U.S. assets in U.S. dollars, which means we necessarily cannot buy so much from China, because again, their demand from dollars will equal our supply of dollars. Our supply of dollars is when we're buying goods. So that was an absolutely, it's a perfect answer. So the idea here is one can't say that this causes this or this causes this. They're jointly determined. Kind of like if you take a point and you put a line between 2 points, one length doesn't cause another. They're determined at the same time. So the idea here is what countries realize though is, okay, well, if I want to export more to the US, what I can try to do is I can try to push up the dollar, meaning create demand for the dollar, and that demand for the dollar is then going to turn around and cause the U.S. to buy more from abroad. Like, so we're gonna get all this foreign currency, and so we have to do something with it. So we're going to buy goods from abroad, meaning they're going to create a lot of demand for dollars, and we're going to use that demand for dollars to supply them abroad for goods and services. So this is what countries generally do. There was one point I wanted to make there, right? Just on what Bernanke was talking about. So the idea here is a lot of times people will look at the trade deficit and say, and maybe I should do a separate video on this, but that we buy abroad from because it's cheaper to make it over there. But again, it's a perfect equivalent to say we buy abroad because people want to invest in here. And so what America has that other countries don't have is great capital markets. If you look at a lot of entrepreneurs, they come from abroad and they start companies in the United States because it's easy to raise capital in the United States. So the idea is one of the reasons why we might have a trade deficit. It's perfectly, instead of saying we have a trade deficit because it's cheaper abroad, it's because it's easier to raise capital in the United States, right? So keep that in mind. All right, back to the main point here. So where was I? Current account, financial account. So the idea here is foreign countries can try to get the U.S. to buy more from them by pushing up the value of the dollar. Again, equivalently lowering the value of their currency. So this is called currency manipulation. They're artificially trying to raise the value of the dollar and push down the value of their own currency, right? So the crux of this is we have known countries manipulate their currency, and we just it is widely, if you ask anyone in Washington, is this country a currency manipulator? They say, well, of course they of course they affect the currency. However, we refuse to label any country a currency manipulator, right? Because well, that would require action like tariffs. I think we briefly, maybe around like 10 years ago, for a couple months said China was a currency manipulator. I believe that was a part of like a negotiation tactic, but then we immediately removed it. So the idea here is a lot of our trading partners, if we were to apply the currency manipulation accurately, if we were to apply it accurately, would be labeled as currency manipulators, and that, if not corrected, would have led to tariffs, right? Now, again, I'm not trying to say tariffs are good or bad, but the funny thing is, if we were to enforce the trade agreements that we have on the books, we might, if we were to enforce them accurately, we would probably at some point have levied tariffs on our trading partners. But no one in Washington wanted that, up until now, right? So again, these tariffs are not good for many U.S. companies, right? There's been a lot of pressure to not label countries a currency manipulator, and to let things go as to kind of ignore that part of the trade agreement. So, in summary, keep in mind in financial markets, a law does not equal enforcement, right? And what's going on in the last 30 years with our trade balance has shown that law does not equal enforcement, right? And interestingly, I don't think tariffs are being levied now on the basis of currency manipulation. So we've just kind of ignored this and said, okay, we've ignored any sort of environmental argument, and I think they're using national security, so they're using other reasons. Great. All right, well, so I hope this gives you a little bit of context about our what's going on in financial markets with tariffs. Have a great day.